Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Britt Oates. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I've been a museum professional for nearly 10 years now with experience in exhibit development, programming, and visitor services. I also just completed 1 year at Cal State Northridge in the General Anthropology graduate program. Now, before I continue, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm speaking with you today from my home in Northridge, a Los Angeles suburb in Southern California, which is situated on the ancestral lands of the Fernandeño Tataviam Band of Mission Indians. My somewhat informal talk today, which I call Confessions of a Museum Professional, Insights for Anthropology Students, is meant to give those who are interested a bit of an insider scoop into museum work and how anthropology can actually fit into that. I've had a very special bond with museums my entire life. It took me a long time to realize that I was actually meant to do museum work, though. So my journey is full of all sorts of twists and turns. However, when I look back on that journey from this point, I do realize that every experience played an integral part in getting me to where I am today, not just as a museum professional or an anthropologist, but really as a human being. I have learned so much about the museum world and myself along the way, and I really hope that my story and the insights that I can offer will be helpful for anyone who's interested in museum work but may not know much about it or where to start, and also be some benefit for anybody who's simply curious because, in my opinion, everything that's great starts with curiosity. So with that, I'm going to share my story, which is really just my journey toward this museum life that I live. I also want to talk about some modern dynamics of this relationship between anthropology, museums, and of course the world. And I want to talk about some of the lessons that I've learned along the way. Then I absolutely want to hear from you. I want to hear all your thoughts and answer any questions that you may have. So one thing that I always say about museums is that no matter what location you're in, museums are gateways to any part of the world, any period of time, and beyond. They can teleport us anywhere, which is pretty awesome when you think about it. You walk into a museum and suddenly you're in ancient Rome, Nubia, China. Then blink of an eye, you're floating through the Helix Nebula 700 light years away. Then you're 70 million years back in time, eye to eye with a T-Rex. And that's what I felt when I visited a museum for the first time. Like I could go anywhere and do anything. And it all started with these two guys. Now, the man on the left you won't recognize, but I'm sure everybody knows the man on the right. Yes, that is Michael Jackson. Now, the man on the left is Timothy Wayne Oates. He's my late father. And he happened to be Michael Jackson's #1 fan. So naturally, growing up, Michael Jackson was very much part of my family. Now, when I was about 5 years old, I was homesick from school one day with my dad. As part of my healthcare regimen, it was time for a bit of MJ therapy. So my dad put on a VHS tape of Michael Jackson music videos. Yes, VHS tape. For those who don't know what that is, well, I don't want to embarrass myself with my age, so Google it after the talk. But if you're at all familiar with Michael Jackson music videos, then you'll know that most of them were the equivalent of watching a mini action and adventure film. They were, simply put, musical cinematic marvels, especially considering the time period throughout the peak of Michael Jackson's career, which I think was probably more 80s and, of course, through the 90s. So this video comes on, and I'm immediately glued to the screen. I see these people adorned in beautiful gold and crisp linens. They're dancing, moving like ocean waves. I see a king and a queen on gilded thrones. They were just so royal and so enchanting. And the best part of it all was that these people looked like me. This was the Remember the Time music video, which not only featured some incredible Black icons in entertainment, but it portrayed them in this beautifully ancient way. And from that moment, I would not rest until I learned as much as I could about what I was seeing before me. And that was ancient Egypt. I was in love. So much, in fact, that I literally would dream of ancient Egypt in my sleep. The pyramids, the pharaohs, queens, sphinx, mummies. It was all just so fascinating, and I couldn't get enough. So, of course, I would ask my mom and my dad to take me to the library so that I could get books about Egypt. And it was great because I read all of these amazing stories and myths and legends, and I was just completely engulfed in this world that was ancient Egypt. Then one day, my mom took me to an ancient Egyptian exhibition at a museum, and that was it. I was hooked, but not just on ancient Egypt. That day at the museum, which I think may have been the LA County Museum of Art, but I'm not 100% sure, so don't quote me on that. But that day at the museum, my life changed. Not only did I feel like we were transported back in time to ancient Egypt, but we were also being taken around the world to all sorts of amazing faraway places. Rome, Greece, Mesopotamia, Syria, China, India. It was simply magical. Now, this, combined with growing up in the era of films like The Goonies and Indiana Jones, is really what set me on this path of curiosity, discovery, and of course, adventure. But I didn't think about working in a museum at that time. I just wanted to know all about these amazing places and the amazing people in those places. I wanted to visit them and talk to the people and eat the different foods and walk through ancient temples and structures. I wanted exploration and adventure. So I started asking lots of questions. Whenever I would be out somewhere and I would overhear people speaking in a different language, I would ask what language that was. And I'm talking about like going up to strangers, which probably wasn't the safest thing in the world, but I was completely obsessed with wanting to know anything that was different from what I already knew. I was the kid who befriended classmates from other countries when mean kids would make fun of these students for not speaking English properly. I would become friends with foreign exchange students, and I would talk to them and ask them to teach me their language. And usually curse words was the first ones that was of most interest. But regardless, I just wanted to know. I wanted to know as much as I could about who they were and where they came from and everything about their culture. And then as I got older, I began going to museums on my own and just for fun, which a lot of people found kind of weird because I was at that point around like 12, 13, 14 years old. And I was interested in spending my weekends in museums, but I didn't care if people thought it was weird. I loved learning about the world and all the different kinds of people and cultures in it. And visiting museums was the best way I could do that. By 15, I had decided that I wanted to do what was called independent study, which is similar to like homeschool. And by doing this, I thought that I could get a job, I could have money to travel and buy my own trinkets and visit museums whenever I wanted to. And that's pretty much exactly what I did. By 16, I had visited more museums just because than school dances, birthday parties combined throughout my entire life. And this was just in California. Now, fast forward a couple of years to my high school graduation. I had completed all my credits about 6 months early and felt totally free and all grown up. So what does a typical heterosexual, super hormonal girl who thinks she's grown do when she finally feels totally free, independent, and unrestricted? Well, she doesn't chase education. No, she chases love. And about a year later, well, that's when my son was born. So at that point, now I'm 19 years old. I've got a baby. And though I enjoyed this kind of period of young rebellion, I was raised to take responsibility for my actions. So I got a couple of jobs and focused on taking care of my child. 3 years after that, I gave birth to my daughter. So the level of responsibility, of course, doubled. And I gotta shout out my mom because she was the perfect blend of hard ass and biggest and many times only supporter while I was working tirelessly to get my life together during that time. Now, by the time my daughter was about 2 years old, I had accumulated quite a bit of life-changing experiences. Not only had I had 2 kids before the age of 23, But I had also moved to Georgia and back, which was a beautiful disaster. I had been unjustly arrested and ended up spending a night in jail. I attended the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising in LA for jewelry design. And I went for one semester because, well, that's all that I could afford. And then, sadly, my dad was killed by a drunk driver in 2007. My grandfather suddenly passed away in 2008. My dearest and closest aunt suddenly passed away in 2009. I had worked in about 20 different jobs by that time, ranging from retail to office work. By the time age 25 rolled around, really, it felt like I had lived out an entire lifetime already. After working a couple more odd jobs for the next 2 or 3 years or so, one day, my best friend took my kids and I to the California Science Center in Exposition Park. And interestingly enough, that was the one LA museum that I had never been to. And you know what? We had a blast. Everything in the museum could be touched and moved, and everything was bright and colorful and exciting. It had been a long time since I got to enjoy a museum experience, let alone one that was so interactive and fun that my kids could also enjoy it. So it was really a good time. A few weeks after our visit, and many moments of reflecting on how dope that visit was, I made the first great career decision of my life. I decided to apply for a job at the California Science Center. So I went online, downloaded a job application, and applied for the position of guest services host, which is one of the people that you see in the galleries talking to visitors about the exhibits. Now, I knew that I'd be good at that job because, well, I love to talk, and every subject matter covered in that museum was something interesting and fun to learn and talk about. I also knew that I didn't want to settle for a minimum wage job for the rest of my life. So I decided to peruse a West Los Angeles Community College catalog that I had received in the mail. I saw this major that we all know and love called anthropology, and it was listed in the catalog. Now, it was interesting because I didn't know what anthropology was, at least not by name. And then based on this description in the catalog, though, it was clear that anthropology was the thing that I had always done. I was a studier of people. So for me, that was a sign that I should go to college and get a degree in anthropology. And after about 3.5 years going part-time to community college, then 2 years at Cal State Northridge, all while working and even doing some volunteering, which I'll talk about in a moment, at this museum, that's basically what I did. I first received an Associate's of Arts and Sciences degree in anthropology in 2018. Then I got my bachelor's degree in anthropology in 2020. But trust me when I tell you, it was not easy. I was a single mom of 2 small children, working full time, going to school. Talk about being exhausted. But I really focused on balancing out the stress with the things that were joyful. And for me, that was gaining as much museum experience as possible while working on getting my degrees. So after about 2 years working as a gallery host and then being promoted to supervisor, I was also able to volunteer with the exhibit development department there at the museum on one of my days off from work. I did that for about a year, and within that year, I had the time of my life. And that leads us to the connections between anthropology, museums, and of course the world. While working and volunteering at the museum, everything that I was learning in school was coming to life right before my eyes. The galleries on biology and evolution were really fun manifestations of everything that I was learning in my bioanthropology class. Getting to interact with visitors from all over the world was like conducting my own multicultural ethnography every day. On top of that, my curiosity and fearlessness really did push me to make some of the greatest connections and gain experiences that I never thought I could have, especially because growing up as a person of color, getting to do all the amazing things that I've gotten to do is just not part of our standard narrative. For example, Remember my deep love for ancient Egypt? Well, in 2018, that came full circle as I was asked to supervise the King Tut Treasures of the Golden Pharaoh exhibition for its debut world tour, which kicked off at the California Science Center. I got to work with great curators from the Cairo Museum. I got up close and personal with artifacts from King Tut's tomb during and after the exhibition installation. I got to put my archaeological knowledge to the test as I played guessing games with curators about what certain objects may have been used for in ancient times. And as the unofficial museum's amateur Egyptologist, I got to give special VIP tours for celebrities, politicians, and other VIP guests, as well as give professional development talks and community lectures about the exhibition. That's when I realized that I was getting to live out a huge part of what I had been dreaming of my entire life and more. I was studying people and cultures and getting to talk and informally teach about all those fascinating things that I love so much, including things I never even thought I'd be remotely interested in, like the science behind the human and dog bond and aerospace and aviation. I got to assist in the development of the Dogs A Science Tale exhibition and developed the live dog programming from scratch, as you can see in the images on the left, and even was asked to be one of the official exhibition spokespersons, getting to be interviewed by KTLA Channel 5 News live on air. And then, as shown in the photos on the right, I got to help restore parts of the wings of a 1970s DC-3 airplane. And I got to wash the grime off of the last remaining space shuttle external tank, which NASA had previously placed in storage until the space shuttle program ended in 2011. Now, what makes all these experiences so special is the fact that I got to do all of these things before even having a bachelor's degree as a broke, single Black mom. I was living proof that people like me, with my skin color, born without privilege, and constantly stereotyped, can make mistakes like anyone else, but I don't have to settle for being another statistical example of some false narrative that we're inferior. I got to do things that some PhD holders might only dare dream about. And it felt damn good. But then, the year 2020 rears its ugly head. The COVID-19 pandemic is taking lives left and right. Everything shuts down and society starts to lose its mind. People in the streets around the world are chanting their names: Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd. America is forced into the greatest racial reckoning since the civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s. Institutions, large and small, across the country, including museums, begin recognizing their roles in perpetuating systemic racism and inequities, and making attempts to change how they operate and increase diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, otherwise known as DEIA. In June 2020, I decided to organize a peaceful gathering, which consisted of family, friends, and colleagues across Exposition Park. We gathered in front of the Los Angeles Coliseum and marched around the arena, then had a moment of silence in remembrance of George Floyd, and of course, so many other countless victims of race-based police brutality. Now, this inspired coworkers and even museum management to acknowledge and address how they themselves and our institutions had been perpetuating systemic racism and practices of unconscious bias as well. Then, a couple months later, which was about 6 months after the big staff layoff that had took place in March 2020, suddenly I was single-handedly laid off. The reason I was told was due to budget cuts in lieu of the pandemic, but given the amount of inspiration that was sparked from that peaceful gathering in front of the LA Coliseum and the calling attention to things like inequities and unconscious biases within our institutions, It sure was odd, or maybe just bad timing. Now, while I was completely devastated after losing my job, I was also even more fueled to work toward dismantling systemic racism and inequities, especially related to museum work. So, I began a kind of personal mission to engage in what I call anthro-museum activism. And there's one quote that really sums up what this means for me. It's from one of the great pioneers of American anthropology, Ruth Benedict, who said, "The purpose of anthropology is to make the world safe for human differences." Museums tend to be the most widely accessible centers for learning about human differences. So it only feels right to use my anthropological know how to help amplify, protect, and preserve those differences through the combination of museum and activism work. So I went on to become a co-founder of Agate Creatives, a grassroots nonprofit organization dedicated to creating revolutionary museum-like experiences centering anti-racism and social justice. I also co-led a research project established by one of the Cal State Northridge Anthropology Department faculty members called Archival Activism. This incorporated researching archival practices in museums and cultural institutions. And we did use some literature reviews, but mostly it was through conducting interviews with museum and cultural organization personnel, making note of nuances that relate to perpetuating unconscious bias in archival practices. I also helped the Museum of the San Fernando Valley develop the Coming Home, World War II and the San Fernando Valley exhibit, which addresses historical systemic racism and how the Valley proved to be a fairly progressive during the World War II era in areas like housing and healthcare that incorporated things like desegregation and advancements in accessibility for veterans of all colors. Most recently, I've decided to launch myself as an independent museum professional, by which I provide freelance or contract museum services to museums and community organizations. I specialize in exhibit development, programming, and advisement related to visitor services and more, all while prioritizing diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. I decided to work toward establishing myself as an independent museum professional for a lot of reasons, but primarily because I realized that there are a lot of bureaucratic and political nuances that come with museum institutions, and they can often perpetuate systemic racism, unconscious bias, and social inequities through common hierarchical structures, simply because this is part of traditional Western practices surrounding general modes of institutionalization across fields and disciplines, not just museums. And when you think about this, we see this nearly everywhere. Like, for example, in universities and colleges, how each department has a department chair and they answer to a dean who answers to a provost who answers to the institution's president. Most companies have a CEO who's above the vice president, who's above the COO, who's above a director, above a manager, and so forth. Now, I've unfortunately seen and have been impacted by how these structures tend to operate by default firsthand. I've been told by superiors that there was no ladder for me to climb, and I wouldn't get far without a PhD or a master's degree. I've dealt with countless microaggressions, and I've been undermined, underestimated, and I've had my intelligence insulted time and time again. So, to be sure I don't compromise my joy for the work that I do by allowing these kinds of structures to negatively affect my mental and emotional health along with my livelihood, I've become much more selective with the institutions I choose to align with and prioritize doing work for and with people and organizations that prioritize DEIA and, of course, dismantling systemic racism. And they do exist, these kinds of organizations, these kinds of people. Not only are a lot of organizations working toward restructuring their internal practices, but there are a lot of grassroots organizations who are and have established themselves as non-hierarchical. So things are shifting in the museum world in really great ways. It's just going to take a little bit of time and a lot of work. my becoming an independent museum professional is part of my personal anthro-museum activism efforts. But I want to point out that activism work in museums isn't anything new, and it's extremely important for the future of museums. In fact, it's become a major centerpiece of museum work since the 2020 Black Lives Matter movements that got the attention of the whole world. Across social media, organizations and activism groups began putting out statements of solidarity after the killing of George Floyd, blacking out their pages and posting the slogan, "Museums are not neutral." That was a serious call to action for museums everywhere to take accountability for practices which perpetuate systemic racism both internally and externally. The Decolonizing the Museum, also called Decolonize This Place movement, which had been in motion since before the George Floyd incident, was being spotlighted more than ever in 2020. This movement is driven by a recognition of the need to dismantle traditionally imperialistic or white supremacist ideology and practices in museums. It's centered on repatriation, or the returning of improperly acquired artifacts and human remains unethically used in museum exhibits around the world to their places of origin. Also, in addition, it means incorporating principles of diversity and inclusion in their exhibitions and internal operations. And what's great is that anthropologists are endeavoring to help with this. In a 2019 article called "Museums Matter in the Current Climate of Anti-Black Racism," published by the Association for Africanist Anthropology, the director of museum studies at Bryn Mawr College, Monique Scott, stated this: "We are now at a moment where we must rethink the role of anthropology, or anthropologists, in the public sphere. As Decolonize This Place activists have mobilized across the country to question racial practice and representation in museums, perhaps we do indeed need to take radical new steps to decolonize our museums." Anthropologists are practicing anthropology in a multitude of ways in museums, whether for archaeological purposes, visitor survey and evaluation assistance, research, curation, or decolonization efforts. Museums really need anthropologists. This is especially the case considering the universal importance and authoritative status of museums. I found a quote that I really like by German-born conceptual artist Hans Hack, where in it he addresses how museums hold a great deal of power that can be used for good and bad. He says that museums are managers of consciousness. They give us an interpretation of history, of how to view the world and locate ourselves in it. They are, if you want to put it in positive terms, great educational institutions. If you want to put it in negative terms, they are propaganda machines. This is such a powerful quote. And if we take a moment to stop and think about this, really think about the kinds of experiences we've had in museums. Think about why nearly every school we've ever attended, from primary through higher ed, there's always a museum field trip scheduled somewhere along the way. Then we will likely find a great deal of truth in this quote, realizing just how important, how significant museums are in our society and across societies. People all over the globe look to museums for knowledge, inspiration, and connection to the rest of the world and beyond. So now I want to talk a little bit about some of the lessons that I've learned from my experiences so far. First, museums have been pillars of education around the world for a very long time. They hold a special authority over how we understand the world and beyond, and have the power to influence not only how we see the world, but how we decide to live in it as well. Visitors everywhere frequent museums for research, education, as an escape, or to simply have fun. And with the help of technology, museums are able to expand their connections around the world, especially after having to adjust to that pandemic life where everything went remote. And really, that only continues to grow. That's why our anthropological training is so important in museum work. Anthropologists use at times specialized methods, but more importantly, we use our keen sense of ethics and humanity to help museums create inclusive educational experiences that museums then should make fully accessible to as many communities as possible. And anthropologists aren't limited to working in exhibits and collections either. Museums typically have multiple departments, and the bigger the institution, the more areas for anthropologists to get involved in, like marketing or advancement, visitor services, programming, and so many more. I've also learned that activism is important, and it can be part of nearly every aspect of museum work, from internal to external operations and experiences. It's important to understand that and our place in it, which can require a bit of soul searching. There can be a lot of deep-rooted problematic traditions in museum institutional practices, usually backed by bureaucratic leadership, executive boards, and hierarchical structures, which can make activism efforts challenging. So it is really important to gauge personal bandwidth from a mental and emotional standpoint and to take breaks. Museum work can be very layered as is. So adding activism to that naturally requires some emotional labor, which makes it easier to get burned out. So it is crucial to maintain balance. A big eye-opener for me was realizing that not everything is what it seems, including the level of complexity I once thought museum work involves. While there is some complexity to it, of course, especially depending on specifics, being a museum professional is not as intimidating as it might seem, especially if it's in a fun, equitable, and inclusive atmosphere. Fancy credentials aren't everything. Remember, I got to do a lot of fun and enlightening work before having any degrees, which means it's really more about getting a foot in the door, whether that's through volunteering or an entry-level paid position, and making good connections. Experience is key. Now, that does not mean that degrees are useless or obsolete, not yet anyway, because in our society, clearly they matter and can make a difference in helping us make informed decisions. But there's nothing like getting firsthand real world experience. Never forget that. And then as far as volunteering is concerned, what I recommend is volunteering if you have the time and are getting something out of that labor beyond experience. It's easy for young people, and especially people of color, to become taken advantage of or exploited with their free labor. So make sure you're getting tangible benefits. Even if not monetary, there should be some incentive and form of compensation for volunteer work. I also had to learn to really listen to my gut and trust myself. We are under so much societal pressure to follow certain culturally constructed blueprints for success that we often second guess ourselves, leading to damaging internalizations like imposter syndrome. But I've found that truly knowing myself and listening to myself establishes a kind of Gandhi-like self-assuredness and confidence that serves as the best possible guidepost. It's important to center oneself with honesty and integrity while remaining open to endless possibilities. Lastly, my greatest takeaways are to remind myself why I'm doing the work that I do and what about it gives me joy. Regardless of what anyone does, it should be motivated by what evokes joy.